He stood there in his tuxedo, front and center, smiling. The picture-perfect moment every groom dreams of. But then the laughter stopped. The aisle went quiet. The air felt heavy. Margaret froze, microphone trembling in her hand, as everyone watched her face change from excitement to shock. Behind her, Richard stood beside his new wife, smirking like he owned the moment. Guests whispered, "Isn't that his ex?" Then a spotlight found the tiny curve of Margaret's belly, hidden under her dress, weeks along, a secret she never meant to reveal on a day like this. Everyone gasped. Some stared, mouth open. Others shook their heads, unsure whether to celebrate or recoil. Richard's smile vanished. His eyes widened, then flickered with fear as something in that room shifted. Because what Margaret was about to say would change everything, not just for Richard, but for every person watching. How did a wedding meant to embarrass her turn into the moment that destroyed him? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Cole had always been the kind of man people admired from a distance but feared up close. The type who shook hands too firmly and corrected even the smallest details to protect his image. In the city where he lived, people described him as successful, sharp, the kind of guy who never let life surprise him. But those who truly knew him saw someone different, someone who needed control like oxygen. Margaret Williams had once loved that version of him, the version he presented to the world, long before she learned how quickly admiration could turn into a cage. Warm, humble, and gifted with a voice that could quiet a room, she carried herself gently, even now as pregnancy fatigue tugged at her every step. Across the room stood Emily, Richard's new bride, elegant and soft-spoken, smiling politely at guests while having no idea how many truths had been kept from her. And while this wedding took place in an upscale American city where people valued appearances, no one realized appearances were the very thing keeping them from seeing what was truly unfolding. Richard had introduced Margaret to the guests earlier with a rehearsed grin, telling them she had begged him for a chance to perform because she needed the money. Some of them nodded with sympathy, others with quiet judgment, unaware of how carefully he had crafted that story to protect himself. But that wasn't just a lie. It was a warning sign, a glimpse into the lengths Richard would go to rewrite reality before it exposed him. In truth, he had abandoned Margaret the moment she told him about the pregnancy, and when complications began threatening her ability to keep working, he denied being the father altogether. Rent had fallen behind. Doctor visits piled up. Yet he still acted like she was the one clawing for attention. What Richard didn't know was that the song she chose tonight carried something he had tried very hard to bury. Something powerful enough to crack open the mask he wore so tightly. People believed Margaret had shown up tonight because she needed the small payment Richard offered, but the truth reached far deeper than that. As she stood on stage, steadying her breath, she wasn't thinking about money or the judgmental eyes watching her. She was thinking about the nights she cried alone, the messages he ignored, the promises he made and then tossed aside without hesitation. She also thought about the little heartbeat growing inside her and how much courage it took to stand here at all. This wasn't desperation. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even revenge. Margaret came here for something he never expected, a truth he could no longer outrun, a truth her song would force him to face. And as the room waited in confused silence, only one question mattered now. Why would a woman who had every reason to walk away choose to confront the man who hurt her in the one place he believed he was untouchable? Because Margaret didn't come for the money. She came for something else entirely. In the months before the wedding, Margaret often replayed the early days of their relationship, trying to understand where things had gone wrong. Richard had once been charming, attentive, the kind of man who made her feel like the world softened when he walked into a room. But over time, his warmth cooled into something rigid, something that made her second-guess every word she spoke. He became obsessed with how people viewed him, correcting her outfits, her friends, even the way she sang, as if every part of her existence reflected directly on him. His friends didn't help. They whispered that settling down too soon would ruin his status, that he needed someone more polished. When Margaret told him she was pregnant, his reaction wasn't fear, it was anger. He accused her of trying to trap him, called her a burden, sent messages so cruel she could barely read them. And just when she thought she had reached her lowest point, She discovered he had already begun seeing Emily long before their relationship had fully ended. But that wasn't the worst part, because Margaret had something he never expected. Weeks later, when a thick cream envelope arrived in her mailbox, she assumed it was another bill or a reminder she couldn't afford to face. Instead, it was a formal wedding invitation printed on expensive paper, the kind that smelled faintly of perfume and wealth. Her throat tightened as she read the names, Richard Cole and Emily Hart. But inside the envelope was something far more disturbing. A handwritten note from Richard himself that said, "Sing for us. You owe me this." She could almost hear his voice in those words, controlling even now, as if she should feel grateful to be included in the celebration of the man who discarded her. She wanted to tear it apart, to burn it, to forget any of this had ever touched her life. Then she noticed a second slip tucked behind the card, a check. But the memo line didn't say performance fee or wedding entertainment. It said, for silence. And suddenly the air in her apartment felt colder. Silence about what? What was Richard so afraid of her saying? Margaret paced her living room for hours, the check sitting like a heavy weight on the table. She knew performing at his wedding would be humiliating. The whispers, the stares, the pity from people who wouldn't understand her story. She also knew the money could help her catch up on rent, cover her next doctor's appointment, ease at least one of the fears that kept her awake at night. But none of that answered the real question. Why did he think she had something to keep quiet? As the evening sun dimmed, the truth surfaced slowly, like something long buried rising to the top. It wasn't the money that pushed her toward acceptance. It was the realization that he believed she was too weak, too wounded, too dependent to ever speak for herself. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something sharper than fear, resolve. She picked up a notebook and began writing, not a speech, not a plea, but a song. A song woven with every truth he wanted buried. A song he would never see coming. As days passed, Margaret found herself sharing small pieces of her plan with the only person she trusted, a neighbor named Grace, an older woman who often brought her soup when the pregnancy symptoms became too overwhelming. Grace listened quietly to the details, her brow furrowed with concern as she warned, "Be careful. Men like him don't like being exposed." Margaret knew she was right, yet the song continued to grow, each lyric sharper, braver, truer than the last. She wasn't writing it for revenge. She was writing it for the child she carried, for the woman she used to be, and for every moment Richard tried to twist into shame. But as the wedding day approached, Margaret sensed something strange. Certain messages from people she barely knew. Certain glances from those connected to Richard. And she realized one unsettling truth. Richard wasn't the only one with something to hide. Someone else at that wedding knew the truth too. Emily Hart grew up surrounded by quiet luxury, raised by parents who measured kindness through gestures and success through stability. To them, Richard seemed like the perfect choice, ambitious, respectable, polished enough to stand confidently beside their daughter at any charity gala or family gathering. Emily believed in people's goodness, and she believed deeply in Richard's. She never questioned the way he steered conversations or how he avoided speaking about his past relationships. She trusted him the way a sheltered heart often trusts the first person who promises forever. A few weeks before the wedding, she found a message on his phone from an unsaved number, Margaret's number, containing a single line asking him to please return her call. Emily frowned at it, wondering why he looked so tense when he came out of the shower and grabbed the phone from her hands a little too quickly. She told herself it was nothing, that every relationship had small misunderstandings. But if Emily had read one more message, the wedding never would have happened. Meanwhile, across the city, Margaret was living a life that felt heavier than the one she planned for herself. Every morning brought a wave of nausea that left her gripping the sink, whispering to her child that they were going to be okay even when she wasn't sure she believed it. She budgeted groceries down to the penny, choosing essentials and hoping they would last through the week. Still, at night, when the world quieted and loneliness pressed in, she practiced her song softly, one hand resting over the small fluttering kicks beneath her skin. There was a warmth in those moments, a sense of motherhood that wrapped around her like a blanket, reminding her she wasn't entirely alone. The lyrics she wrote felt like little pieces of truth stitched together, and each verse gave her strength she didn't know she still had. But as she practiced in the dim living room, Unaware of the shadows just outside her window, she had no idea someone was watching Margaret, someone who followed her to every rehearsal. It started subtly. A car parked across the street longer than it should have, headlights dimmed, engine humming quietly in the dark. At first, Margaret thought nothing of it. People parked there all the time. But when she noticed the same car 2 days later while she walked to the community center to practice, something inside her tightened. One evening, as she left rehearsal clutching her notebook against her chest, she spotted a figure sitting in the car, camera raised, a flash quickly covered by a hand as if to hide the evidence. Her pulse quickened. She hurried home, locking her door twice. Hours later, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. No greeting. No explanation. Just 3 words that made her hands tremble. Don't sing that song. She stared at the message until her vision blurred, unsure whether to feel frightened or furious. The question that echoed through her mind was the one she feared most. Was it Richard? Or someone else afraid of what she might reveal? In the days leading up to the wedding, the truth about Richard's motives began to form a clearer, darker shape beneath the surface of his polished exterior. He wasn't marrying Emily simply because he loved her. He was marrying into the stability her family provided. His business had been quietly bleeding money for months, deals falling apart, investors stepping back, and the appearance of success slipping through his fingers like dust. Emily's father, a man known for rescuing companies he believed had potential, had already hinted at a generous investment, one that would keep Richard afloat long enough to rebuild the image he fought so hard to maintain. But that investment depended entirely on the wedding going smoothly and the family believing he was a dependable, honorable man. One scandal, one whisper of betrayal, one crack in the perfect picture could cost him everything. And Margaret's song, the truth threaded inside it, threatened everything he built. 2 nights before the ceremony, Margaret stopped by a small cafe near the venue to warm herself and gather her thoughts. But the air inside turned colder the moment she overheard 2 of Richard's friends at a nearby table. They laughed in low voices, unaware she was only a few feet away behind a wall. One snickered. Wait till people see the state she's in. He wants her to beg. The other replied. He said she'll finally understand her place. Their words hit her harder than anything Richard had ever texted. Her legs felt weak. She slipped into the restroom before they could notice her, locking herself in a stall as tears finally broke through the composure she had been clinging to. She covered her mouth to keep her sobs quiet, feeling not only the weight of humiliation, but the crushing realization that Richard wanted the world to witness her pain. She whispered to her unborn child, promising she would never let him shape their life the way he had tried to shape hers. When she returned home that night, something in Margaret had changed. She sat on her bed surrounded by crumpled sheets of old lyrics. The original song she planned to sing lying in front of her. It was gentle, forgiving, the kind of song someone sings when they still hope for peace. She realized now that peace was never Richard's intention, so she made a decision she hadn't anticipated. She tore the pages in half and pulled out a fresh sheet, her heartbeat steadying as she picked up her pen. There would be no soft song, no begging, no subtle hints. She rewrote the lyrics entirely, line by line, shaping a message that revealed the truth he had tried so hard to bury. Her voice wouldn't shake. Her story wouldn't be silenced. And by the time she finished writing, long past midnight, hands trembling with a mix of fear and strength, she knew the performance would change everything. Because what she wrote is what destroyed him. The wedding ceremony unfolded with the kind of elegance people expected from families like Emily's. Soft music, polished smiles, flowers arranged with clinical perfection. Emily stood at the altar glowing with hope, completely unaware of the storms circling the edges of the room. Guests settled into their seats, whispering about the bride's beauty, the groom's confidence, and the promise of a perfect union. Outside, Margaret stepped from a rideshare, adjusting her dress, her breathing uneven but determined. She entered quietly, unnoticed at first, blending into the background like someone who didn't want to disturb anything. But while most eyes remained fixed on the bride and groom, one pair in the crowd shifted toward the door the moment Margaret stepped inside. Someone had been expecting her. Someone who didn't come to witness a wedding, but to use her presence as leverage. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she wasn't the only person who had arrived carrying truth that could unravel Richard's life. A few minutes later, The host announced Margaret as the evening's performer. A hush fell over the room. Heads turned. Some guests exchanged looks, recognizing her from glances Richard had thrown earlier. He smirked as she walked to the stage, the kind of smirk that suggested he believed he had already won, that she would play into his story exactly as he intended. She began with a soft, harmless melody, gentle enough to calm even her own shaking hands. People relaxed. Richard leaned back, smug. But then Margaret lifted her eyes, inhaled slowly, and the room shifted. The music stayed soft, but the lyrics changed, sharp, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. She named dates, each one marking a night Richard had been with her while telling others he was working late. She sang about messages he deleted, promises he broke, the moment he denied her pregnancy. She revealed the truth behind the wedding, the failing finances, the desperate need for Emily's father's money, the investors he misled. And then, with a steady voice, she touched on the scandal buried inside Cole Industries, a scandal Richard hoped would die quietly before anyone noticed. The bride's face drained of color. Shock hardened into betrayal. Emily's father rose from his seat, fury radiating from him. But that wasn't the part that ruined Richard, it was who stood up next. Near the back of the room, a woman Margaret had never seen before pushed her chair aside and stepped forward. Her voice rang out clearly, slicing through the stunned silence. She introduced herself as a former employee Richard had fired after she uncovered internal documents that supported every accusation Margaret had just sung. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and told the crowd she had recorded Richard admitting to the lies the night he let her go. Gasps rippled through the aisle. Some guests stood. Others covered their mouths. Emily staggered back as Richard's face drained of all color, the confidence evaporating into something wild with panic. Phones lifted. People murmured, confused and outraged. And in that single moment, with evidence rising to the surface and truth spreading like wildfire through the room, the wedding erupted into chaos. As the room erupted into gasps and murmurs, Emily's hands shook violently. She reached up, tore off her veil, and let it fall to the floor like something suddenly poisoned. Her eyes, once soft with trust, now burned with disbelief and hurt as she stepped toward Richard. Guests shifted aside, watching with a mixture of pity and dread as she confronted the man she thought she knew. "Is it true?" she demanded, voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. "Is she carrying your child?" Every word echoed through the hall, bouncing off the walls until even those in the far back felt the sting of it. Margaret stood frozen near the stage, unsure whether to breathe or run. The silence grew thick, suffocating, until Richard opened his mouth, an answer forming that none of them expected. Richard's answer shocked everyone, especially Margaret. Richard's denial came quick, frantic, and transparent. He stumbled over excuses, insisting that Margaret was lying, that she wanted attention, that this entire performance was an attempt to sabotage his wedding. But the more he spoke, the more the crowd seemed to turn against him. A woman near the front raised her hand and said Richard had lied to her husband about a business deal. Another man stepped forward, claiming Richard had promised him a job at Cole Industries in exchange for a favor that never materialized. Videos appeared as guests scrolled through their phones, clips of Richard bragging at bars, making comments he never expected anyone to record. Buried among the noise was another revelation whispered urgently between guests. Richard had been paying people off for months to hide mistakes in his company, mistakes that were no longer contained. Richard looked around desperately, but each face reflected something different now. Disgust, disappointment, anger. The walls he had built around his image were collapsing faster than he could defend them. Emily's father, normally a man of calm stature, pulled out his phone with a cold steadiness that cut deeper than yelling ever could. He spoke in low, serious tones to his attorney, mentioning terms like fraud, breach, and criminal liability. The conversations around the room shifted from gossip to legal speculation, people whispering about what could happen to Cole Industries. Within minutes, someone pointed out the window where two unmarked cars had pulled up, lights flashing only once before shutting off. Authorities stepped out quietly, scanning the entrance as if already briefed on what they might find inside. Panic flickered across Richard's face. Margaret watched from the corner, feeling an unexpected mix of fear and release. But the biggest twist was still coming. As tension filled the hall, the doors opened again, and a man walked in, calm, focused, familiar only to Margaret. Her breath caught as she recognized him. The man from the car, the one who watched her rehearsals, the one who sent the warning message. But instead of menace, his expression carried purpose. Emily gasped and rushed toward him. He was her family's investigator, hired months earlier when her father sensed something was off about Richard's sudden eagerness to marry into their wealth. The investigator explained that he had followed Margaret not to intimidate her, but to protect her. He believed she held the key to exposing Richard's actions, and he knew she might be targeted once the truth came close to the surface. "I wasn't watching her to silence her," he said firmly. "I was watching to make sure she lived long enough to tell the truth." The room fell silent again, fear and realization blending into something heavier than before. And what he uncovered next changed everything again. As the investigator stepped forward, the weight of what he carried settled over the room like a cold shadow. He cleared his throat and announced that Margaret wasn't the only woman Richard had betrayed. In the course of his investigation, he uncovered documents that revealed Richard had fathered another child with a third woman months before he met Emily. There had been a quiet paternity lawsuit, buried under legal agreements, sealed motions, and payments meant to disappear without a trace. Emily staggered back, as if the ground itself betrayed her. Guests whispered sharply, the air thick with disbelief. Margaret felt her chest tighten, realizing she wasn't alone in her suffering. But even that wasn't the darkest part, because the truth was far more calculated than reckless affairs and hidden children. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about survival, Richard's survival, at the expense of anyone who crossed his path. The investigator handed Emily's father a set of printed emails, each more damning than the last. In them, Richard's own attorney had warned him that if Margaret ever spoke up about the cheating, the child, the abandonment, his pending merger would collapse instantly. Investors would pull out within hours. Partnerships he spent years chasing would disintegrate. His company, the empire he flaunted like a badge of honor, would crumble beneath him. Every message revealed panic, desperation, and something far more sinister, a plan. Richard intended to humiliate Margaret publicly at the wedding, to portray her as unstable, attention-seeking, untrustworthy. If he could destroy her credibility in front of dozens of witnesses, then anything she said afterward could be dismissed as bitterness or jealousy. He didn't invite her to sing. He invited her to fall apart under the spotlight. He believed the shame would silence her forever, but he underestimated her strength, her courage, and the truth she carried in her voice. Because while the room simmered with chaos and revelation, Margaret stepped back toward the microphone, placed a hand gently over her stomach, and looked directly at Richard. And Margaret had just one more verse to sing. Margaret stepped back to the microphone, the weight of the entire room pressing toward her, every heartbeat suspended in the air. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her child move gently beneath her palm, and when she opened them again, her voice rose with a clarity that silenced even the whispers lingering at the edges of the hall. The final verse wasn't about Richard, or revenge, or humiliation. It was about strength, her strength, the strength she found in the quietest moments of her suffering. She sang of motherhood, of the small life growing inside her, of the promise to raise her child with love instead of fear. She sang about truth, about refusing to bow her head, about refusing to be silenced ever again. Her voice didn't tremble. It soared. And as the lyrics washed over the stunned crowd, something extraordinary happened. Guests stood one by one, drawn to the raw honesty of her words. Some clapped through tears. Others covered their mouths, crying openly. Beneath the stage lights, Margaret felt a softness brush her shoulder. Emily stepped forward, tears streaking down her face, and took Margaret's hand without hesitation. For the first time, they stood united, not as rivals, not as broken women, but as two people finally free from the lies that had entangled them. Richard's reaction shattered what little dignity he had left. His face twisted in frustration as he yelled at the guests who dared to stand against him, shouting that they didn't know the real story, insisting that everything being said was exaggerated or fabricated. But the more he screamed, the more people backed away, their expressions hardened with disappointment and disgust. When security stepped in to restrain him, he fought, claiming he was the victim, his voice cracking under the weight of unraveling control. Emily lifted her chin, calm but resolute, and held up something Margaret had quietly slipped into her bouquet before her performance, a small USB drive. It contained recordings, messages, documents Margaret had kept for months, proof of every lie, every denial, every financial manipulation Richard thought he had erased. She handed it directly to the investigator, sealing the final piece of the puzzle. Moments later, as the evidence became undeniable and officers stepped forward to take him into custody, Richard's voice finally fell silent. Emily didn't look away as he was escorted out of the hall, his final protests fading into the distance. The climax arrived not with violence, but with truth, unshakable, undeniable truth, and for the first time, Margaret felt the world tilt back toward justice. In the quiet that followed Richard's arrest, something unexpected unfolded. Emily's family, once strangers to Margaret, approached her with warmth, offering support without hesitation. Emily's father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and assured her she would not face the rest of her journey alone. Several guests, moved by the bravery of her performance, asked about her music, promising to share her name with friends in the industry. What began as a devastating day slowly transformed into the start of something new, doors opening where they had once been firmly closed. As Margaret prepared for motherhood, she felt a strength she hadn't recognized in herself before, a sense of grounding that came from facing truth without fear. She stepped out into the evening air feeling lighter than she had in months, knowing that although her path had been broken open in painful ways, it was now leading somewhere she could finally breathe. Sometimes the truth needs only one voice to finally be heard. And now, the question becomes yours. What do you think? Did Margaret get the justice she deserved? Or should Richard face even more consequences? If this story hit you like it did us, hit that like button. It helps us reach more people. And subscribe if you want more gripping stories every day.